One. And then we examined the California indigenous people in our local area, and we focused on the local Patwin. That's the Wintun nation, and Patwin is for our geographic area. Then we met last in February, and we continued the history of the Peñas and the Vacas with an abbreviated California timeline, beginning at the 1690s and going all the way through to the 1860s. Then we also continued our discussion on the Patwins with an update on Semiedo, or as we know him, as Chief Solano. Today, for our third and final presentation in this series, we present part 3, a closer look at the Peña and the Vaca families and the role the local indigenous people had on these settlers' lives. We welcome back Armando Perez. He is of Chiricahua and Apache descent. He is a Peña Adobe Historical Society board member and docent. He will begin the presentation with a Native American blessing. He will be followed by Cecilia Peña. She's a 5th generation Peña. She's also a board member and docent. Cecilia will then introduce her second cousin, Darlene Peña Coombs, another 5th generation Peña and society docent. Then Armando will return to discuss the local indigenous people and their role in the local settlers' lives. And then Historical Society member Brian Irwin will close the event with a reading by poet Edwin Markham in this, our final presentation. We will then have time to answer questions from you. And if you're joining us today on Zoom, feel free to post in the chat box your questions, and then we'll answer all your questions at that time. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to review some of the artifacts that we brought with us from our museum. James Tunstall, another Native American docent from the society, and I will meet you back there, and we can show you some of the things that we brought with us. Armando?
I'm not a professional. Where I have all my information. You can pick it up over there. Okay. Okay, I'll go ahead. And my blessings anyway. Before each gathering, the indigenous people of the different tribes here in the Americas would always say a blessing to the people. Oh, great creator, listen to me. Bless all these people that are here with us today. Bless all the people that we have lost and gone to the great heavens. I hear you talking. I hear you in the winds. I hear you in the water. I hear you staying in the winds talking to me. Bless all the children. Bless everyone that we have lost, and bless our group today. So in that, I thank you, great creator.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming, and I'm glad that you're here to enjoy the third talk. I do encourage you to listen to the first two, where I kind of set up this particular one. Located in Pastoral Lagoon Valley in Vacaville, halfway between San Francisco and Sacramento, California's capital, is the Peña-Vaca Park. The center of attraction at the 1.5-acre park is the oldest restored structure in Solano County, the Peña-Vaca, California Historical Landmark number 534, and the former home of the Peña family. This year is the 182nd anniversary of the arrival of the Peñas and the Vacas to the lagoon area. The mission of the Peña-Vaca Historical Society is to preserve the history of the Peña-Vaca and provide educational and cultural services to the community. You may wonder, what history is our job to preserve? That means for us, first of all, preserving the history of the land we lived and prospered on. Our 182-year-old history is only a minute of the history we aim to preserve. Humans have deep history in our Lagoon Valley area. Our family lived and prospered on the land of the people we called the Patwin, a southern brand of the Winton group, native inhabitants of California since approximately 500 AD. Our adobe sits directly on top of a former village of the Malacca, a Patwin tribelet. An archaeologist site at our nearby creek was dated to be an early Holocene, early Archaic summer camp occupied 8,800 years ago. After the families were given 10 leagues of indigenous land, 10 square leagues of indigenous land, they then used the displaced people as laborers on the ranchos, both as vaqueros and family servants. We lived with the Patwin artifacts. Later in our program, Armando will continue telling the story about this area's indigenous past during the times our family lived there. We also preserve the family's history. My great-great-grandparents, Juan Felipe, here's Juan Felipe up here, and Isabella, as she was known in the family, and Peña's partner, Juan Manuel Vaca, Vacaville's namesake. They were all born in the Santa Fe, New Mexico area under Spanish rule in the 1790s. The families came from one region of Mexico to another as Mexican citizens in 1841. They passed away in California as a US state. They considered their nationality to be Spanish, although they were of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage. No one had been born in Spain for likely a couple of hundred years. Some colonists arrived in California with or attained upper-class status, mainly through ranching or the acquisition of land grants. And some became identified as pure-blooded Spaniards, such as my own family. Let's discuss their names for a minute. There likely was some reinvention going on here. You see the Vaca name up here. What's that all about? And what's Armijo? We never call the Peñas Armijos around here. Juan Manuel Vaca with a B is only known as Vaca with a V here in Northern California because he was born as Juan Manuel Vaca with a V, by the way. He signed a land grant with the name Juan Manuel Cabeza de Vaca. A distant ancestor, born in 1490. We don't know why he did this, to elevate himself, possibly. Was it a play on words? Vaca with a V means cow. That's kind of a no-brainer, right? They were ranchers. But Vaca with a B actually means luggage rack. And Juan Felipe, his record shows Armijo. Although he insisted his name was Peña, this was a name that was used in his family. Perhaps he used the name Peña to distance himself from the cruel New Mexican governor, Manuel Armijo. And also Vaca and Peña's fellow Anglo travelers from New Mexico were Governor Armijo's political enemies. So maybe they just wanted to not bring up Armijo. Or maybe because Isabella, Peña's wife, was an Armijo too. They were distant cousins, Felipe and Isabella. Her cousins were already here in California and they were Armijos. Now, by the way, Peña with a tilde, I always put a tilde over my name, means crag or rock. Without the tilde, pena means emotional pain. So Spanish names mean something. And I would much rather be known as rock or crag rather than emotional pain. Thank you very much. Vaca and Peña were really different. Vaca had political aspirations and Felipe had financial ones. We'll see shortly how that plays out and why we know much more about the Peñas than the Vacas. So here's the family. I've gathered the first couple of generations. This is, for some of them, they're only known photos. So I have them gathered here so that you can see them all at once. This is their first and only group photo. And then the list down below is the third generation. I've listed their children's names. Who the second generation married and who they chose as godparents was more evidence of their upper class status. The family groups included such names as Berryessa, Vaca, Trujillo, Avila. Juan Felipe, who was mostly referred to as Felipe in the family, and Isabella were both 43 when they came. The Peña children ranged in age from the oldest, this is Jesus, to the youngest, Nestora, the only girl. Vaca was about 6 years older than Peña. And the Vacas and the Armijos, though, from New Mexico were linked in New Mexican history, with Vaca being the predominant older name and the older family. We believe that they worked together in New Mexico, possibly as partners, then as well, and knew ranching, trading, and farming. They seem to know how to do all this stuff. Felipe and all the children became rancheros here, or rancheras, because Nestora was a rancher too. There was Jesus, as I said, Demetrio. There's Francisco. We didn't have a photo of him, so here's a drawing. Here's Darlene and my great grandfather. That's our heritage here. Cavino, and then Nestora. It's Nestora we know most about. She lived from 16 to 40 years longer than her brothers. But mostly it was her conversations with her nieces passed down to us, which brings our family history to life. Now, the Old Spanish Trail had been strictly a trade route developed to provide trade by land between California and New Mexico from 1829 until 1848, the end of the Mexican-American War. Since California lacked sheep, pack trains brought woven Mexican products from New Mexico and traded them for California horses and mules in short supply in New Mexico. The Old Spanish Trail system was cobbled together from indigenous trails during Mexican, not Spanish, rule. The first designated trail was the Armijo route. That's this more southern route here. The founding of it was credited to Antonio Armijo, our matriarch Isabella's cousin, the cousin I spoke of earlier. Vaca and Peña were among a group of others who, for the first time in the trail's history came to California to live. They made their 2-month journey in the fall of 1841 with a Roland workman party on what is considered the main route. The main route is this middle route here. That route, by the way, was founded by our neighbor, John Reed Wolfskill's brother, William. They mostly walked the 1,200 miles on the oftentimes treacherous trail from Abiquiu in northern New Mexico to its terminus in what would become El Pueblo de Los Angeles. Think about that, walking an average of 20 miles a day for 2 months on sometimes foot over foot treacherous trails. There were no wagons on this trail. There were no covered wagons. That did not happen. There are portions of the trail that they used wagons on, but not on most of it. You needed mules to do that, and they brought the mules. The decision to move had been planned for a number of years. Vaca had even checked it out, had come here in 1839. Now, there were lots of reasons to leave New Mexico: political unrest, restricted trade, ethnic tensions, etc. But not only were they leaving these issues in their ancestral homes, I might add, these people were going towards something. They saw an opportunity. They had witnessed Western expansion in their own New Mexico, and they wanted to be the first to this territory here in California. And like most immigrants, they wanted a better life. Who wouldn't want to move to California? I mean, right? Since 1835, General Mariano Vallejo, a Californio born in Monterey, was the director of colonization for California's northern frontier and had authority over all of the land north of San Francisco. Here's Vallejo down here. Picture I've never seen before. He was young there. Our families, encouraged by our Armijo family, who were already here, and also had a land grant, heeded their friend and political ally Vallejo's call, come get your land. Now here's little Apollonia Vaca, that's her right here. She was only 3 years old, and I don't know if you can see this, but she's kind of pointing the way. There's her arm outstretched. And here's Nestora, right here, the smallest, and she was a tiny person. She was a tiny child, so she looked like a 3-year-old herself. And they were placed in, quote, in saddlebags on a gentle mule. This moment in time was captured here in this drawing and was actually passed down as a recollection from Nestora herself to her nieces. When I was small, I was given an audience with my great Aunt Rose, one of the Peña granddaughters. And I came into this room and it was all dark, and there was this older woman sitting there, and she proceeds to tell me this story about Nestora. And I think I must have been sitting there with my mouth open because I was really shocked by it. And then she told me that Nestora was my own father's godmother, for heaven's sakes. I mean, you know, that third degree of separation thing. It's like my own father knew Nestora. I mean, history was so close, I felt like I could touch it. It really altered my perception of time and of history in meeting my Aunt Rose. And I was hooked on this research. They took an additional month, thankfully now, by wagons to Northern California, less dangerous for sure, but they said that they froze in our unfamiliar fog. They had never experienced anything like fog before. On the way to claim the land, the family brought a crew of 30 men from the Santa Barbara mission to build their adobes. The crew would later become the rancho's first vaqueros. We also brought grapes from there, by the way. Their grape startups were from the Santa Barbara mission. Isabella and the young Peñas and Vacas were left with the Vallejo family in Sonoma, where they were likely tutored. along with the Vallejo's children. The men would go on to Laguna Valley and build their adobes and begin their ranchos. Oats, oaks, and grizzly bears. This is one of my favorite things. An old 1878 Solano County Atlas says, all the valleys were covered with a most luxuriant growth of wild oats, among which fed vast herds of wild cattle, horse, elk, and deer. While on the hills and in the canyons of the mountains, the fierce grizzly disputed the supremacy of the soil. Stories depict trappers seeing up to 6 bears in an oak tree feeding on acorns. Geez, I mean, this is a real thing. This photograph here, this is a real photograph taken at the Oakland Zoo. Now, this is just one grizzly bear. But look, it looks like he's standing on a twig. That's a 30-foot tree. So don't, if you ever see a grizzly bear, do not go up in the tree. All right. Now, and our family continued to have difficulties with bears in the beginning and had to construct high fences to keep them out. Adopting dogs from the indigenous communities ended most of their problems. Later, the family, bolder and feeling more in charge, it was reported that they even had a bear and bullfight at Demetrio's wedding. I don't want to hear about that. I'm not going to talk about that. We also preserve the history of the adobes. Fulfilling the requirement to build homes, plant trees, and pasture livestock within 1 year, they set about to build both adobes. The adobes were originally built by our Santa Barbara crew. And the adobes were originally about 1/3 mile from each other. Notice the size difference in this drawing. Vaca's was bigger with 4 rooms, presumably an attic. You can see an attic room up here. And it was 64 feet by 24 feet. The Peña's was 50 feet by 18 feet with a more modest design. It had only 3 rooms in an attic. The walls are 2 feet thick and made of 23-inch by 10-inch by 3-inch sun-dried adobe mud bricks. The soil, according to Aunt Rose, was retrieved from the base of the hill just east of the adobe home. It had dirt floors and hand-hewn redwood timbers cut in the hills near Napa. Now, adobes are vulnerable in our Northern California climate and earthquake-prone state. In fact, Vaca's adobe fell in the earthquake of 1892, but long after he had passed away. This drawing was, Vaca had moved to the northern side of the land grant in the 50s, and the second owner, the Hills, owned the adobe. And this 1930s drawing was made under the guidance of a Hill family member that had actually lived in the Vaca adobe. So it's as accurate as we could ever find it. The Peña adobe here was with this watercolor was painted by Felipa Peña, who was the youngest Peña's son, Gavino's granddaughter. So Vaca and Peña petitioned and received their first Mexican land grant in 1843. 10 square leagues of Patwin land, that's 44,383.78 acres, in case you want to figure that out. Their diseño, which is this hand-drawn map, which was attached to the petition, with given the boundaries, it has the Sacramento River on this side and the Napa Mountains on this side, and the Lejuitos, which was what became Putos Creek, actually, this area up here, and down here Sassoon. So that's a really big area. And here, here I'm going to show you, I've superimposed those boundaries onto my map here. They had, so that this decenio actually covered something like 20 square leagues of land, at least. I mean, look at how big it is. Now, this right here is the patented land grant that they received in 1858. Because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which explicitly guaranteed Mexican Americans the right to their property, language, and culture, they granted the land, but it was after a long protracted fight. And by the time they actually did this survey and were granted the grant, a lot of this land had already been gone to squatters. But you can see, but this is how they would have operated with the original decennial borders for most of the time that there was a cattle boom. So that was kind of surprising to me. And you can see that the only place, you can't see, but I can see, the only place they really ran into a border problem was up here. This was Wolfskill. You heard me mention Wolfskill. You can see how, you know, they were encroaching upon his land. Over here, there was the Napa Mountains. Here, there was basically, you know, range land. And on this side, here's the river over here, Sassoon down here. And the Telenos Ranch, that's where the Armijos lived, were below us right here. And were we to have gone over that boundary, that probably wouldn't have mattered. Now, we don't know where the Peñas and the Vacas really ran their cattle. They would need water for sure to do their matanzas. They needed that, and they needed water to and feed and all that other kind of stuff. So we don't really know. They could have gone beyond these. We don't know, but who would have known and who would have stopped them, basically. Now, in 1859, 9 years after California statehood and 2 years after the patented US land grant, each of the Peña children, rather than inheriting their land from Peña, purchased the acreage from their father. We don't really know why. Was this a way, a learning moment for the children? It likely was that, but where each family group could fail or succeed on their own merits, or was it entirely practical? They might have been able to protect some of their holdings, their land holdings this way, by having another member of the family own some of the land. I think, who knows, but both things likely happened. But this strategy succeeded. Whatever it was, Vaca's family saw his land holdings dissipate within 40 years of their arrival, but the Peña family sold the last of their land in 1957. That's 116 years. Oh, by the way, these this was for my last talk, and this shows some of our other neighbors here. These blue, these are land grants, these interesting shapes. They were all, these are all Berriesas. Here's Solano, Chief Solano down here, or Semieto. This is the Armijo Ranch, Vallejo's over here. He had other holdings. This was just some of the land grants at the time. Okay, so let's look closer at this Peña adobe. All of these photos are from the back of the house. Here's the adobe after its restoration in the early 1960s, looking very similar to what it may have looked in the early 1850s. The two main differences would have been the roof would have been tule, and the window coverings would have been stretched cowhide in the beginning. Now, rather than remudding or even painting their adobe, they encased the adobe in redwood siding, shown here. And they enlarged their house, as you can tell, considerably. And this was maybe even earlier than that, but certainly as early as 1860. The wooden siding protected the adobe, but equally important, it looked just like every other farmhouse, which is a goal that they would have wanted. They didn't want to look like the adobe. They wanted to look like everyone else in the area, particularly during these times. This photo, this is Nestora right here, the youngest girl, that little girl on the mule. Here she is with her husband and a family friend. This was around 1880s, somewhere in the 1880s. Now up here is the National Park Service's American Building Survey in 1962. I've oriented the drawing to conform with a Google Map compass, so you could see the orientation of the adobe. And you can see here the gray line inside is the adobe, and the lighter line on the outside is the house that was built around it. Here the adobe is on the right. Notice the access to the attic right here, or the Tampico, what they called it. It was said to originally house Felipe's silver that his horse wore. Later, the area would be the home for the household servants. According to family lore, 3 indigenous women, Ramona and the 2 Marys. Here's our old elm. This elm right here, you see the elm in every picture. This was built before the adobe was, this was built. This was planted well before the adobe was built. And this is our own orange tree, our special orange tree here. It was a gift from our neighbor Wolfskill. And it's somewhere in the early 1860s. It still produces oranges, and they are really, really quite sweet. Now, even when the former adobe house looked like just a farmhouse, you would step onto the porch and you'd walk in to here's the original door, the lock, the keys and everything. You would walk in and not walk into a farmhouse looking place. No, you would walk into the adobe rooms. So let's take a look inside. So here is the adobe inside. As you straight ahead, as you walk in, right directly across from you is the front door. It's an identical door to the one that you just walked through. And that's only where the guests entered, was through the front door. The family always traipsed through the back, and I've invited you in that way because you're friends and family. Here's the La Sala, or the living room. And to the left of the door is the door we just walked through, and you can't see the front door, but it's directly across from that. There's our back is to the parents' room. And when we turn around, here we are standing in La Sala, looking into the parents' room. Probably had a curtain between them. This was the room that my own father was born in 1904. Now here's the farmhouse again. And the part of the farmhouse clear over on the right-hand side, you can kind of see, if you could see closely, some cooking stuff. But this was the kitchen. This area was the kitchen. Although they didn't eat in, they ate inside, but they didn't cook ever inside, probably a fire concern or whatever, but they would cook outside, and the kitchen would be the storeroom. It also was the only place that had a stove at all, but it did have a stove. When they did the renovation, they moved this part of the building over to this area over here, and it now became the museum. It was named after the supervisors who bought the building in 1957 from the family. It's now known by the name of the supervisor, and it's called the Mowers Goheen Museum. And this is the kitchen inside, which is now our museum. It's a cute little building. During the ranching era, during Mexico's rule, there were 10 to 15,000 indigenous people here, non-indigenous, excuse me, people here. By 1845, the ranching economy predominated. And according to Tim Solonides, who is a Berryessa descendant, he writes in his book, The Rape of the Mexican Land Grant, Rancho Cañada de Capay, he said that the cattle barons of what are now Solano, Napa, and Yolo counties were the Vacas, the Peñas, the Armijos, and the Berryessas. Peña alone owned 2,000 cattle and 200 to 300 horses, and his stock was worth $15,000. I love this photo here. The Carefree Dons, they always call them the Carefree Dons. Well, anyway, they loved horses. Wood Young, author of Out of Print, Vaca Peña, Los Putos Rancho, and the Peña Adobe, which is back in the exhibit in the back. You can take a look at it today. He quotes this: they kept one horse saddled at their door during the daylight hours and rode even the shortest distance. It was not dignified to walk to a neighbor's home. Also, since Peña, I know, kept his silver on his horse, and it would be a protection thing too. You didn't want the horse to be wandering off. We know very little really about these times. It was so long ago. We do have some artifacts of the era in our museum, and we have some stories like this one. I'm going to ask Armando to read this quote, but I want to talk to him. I want to tell you more about it. Naval officer and grandson of Paul Revere, Joseph Revere's account of an 1846 journey through Northern California paints a vivid picture. Revere was amazed at the vast ranchos. He enjoyed the weekly rodeos when wild cattle would be gathered and counted. Neighboring rancheros would pick out their own fierro, which is what the brand is. It's a fierro, and sinal, that's the ear mark, and herd their wandering cattle home. Armando will read Joseph Revere's compelling observation. Armando, where's Armando? Is Armando coming to the screen, to the mic, please?
Hello.
There he goes.
I'm not too proud of where that is. Thank you. Thus, amidst clouds of dust, through which might be indistinct glimpse and agitated horns, fierce rolling eyeballs and elevated tails, an occasional wild-looking naked Indian vaquero with his hair and top knot streaming out, or a California vaquero known by his fluttering serape. The bellowing, rushing herd approached the corral.
Thanks, Armando. Armando will be talking more about the vaqueros later in the program. Now, we do have a wonderful account of a fiesta. Luzina Stanley Wilson, who lived from 1819 to 1902, was our neighbor. She lived on our northern border, John Reed Wolfskill's property. The following excerpt is from her diary, Vaca Valley, 1851 to 1855, My Checkered Life, Luzina Stanley Wilson in Early California by Fern Henry. Cricket as Luzina. Cricket? Is Cricket coming?
Her book. Oh,
There she
There.
is.
there it is. That's her book. Okay. We had been in the valley only about 2 months when Senor Vaca came riding over one morning to ask me, but by the aid of an interpreter, to attend a ball to be given at that night at his house. Don Manuel, that's how she refers to Vaca, with his daughter, greeted us with all the ceremony and courtesy of a Spanish grandee and showed us a place of honor. We were ushered into a long room illuminated with tallow dips, destitute of furniture, with the exception of 2 or 3 chairs reserved for the use of the American visitors. The musical accompaniment to the dancing, which had already begun, was played upon the guitar and tambourine, and the laughing, chattering, happy crowd swayed and turned in wave-like undulation to the rhythm of a seductive waltz. The refreshments comprised strangely compounded but savory Spanish stews with hot chilies, great piles of tortillas, and gallons of only tolerable whiskey. Among the prominent and honored guests were members of the most wealthy and influential Spanish families of the country. I remember well the pretty faces and manly figures of the Armijos, Picos, Peñas, and Berriesas, all who have long since been gathered in peace to their fathers or are still living, holding prominent places in various California communities.
Thanks, Cricket. Now, Luzina thought in another excerpt, she had thought that the Peñas had actually gone away. The Peñas and Vacas had gone away because she didn't see them anymore. But they hadn't. They were just unrecognizable to her now as foreign. Now, it seems to me that we often think of history in terms of a series of events. And as I've delved into the questions about who these people really were, I found that history is really about people living their lives. They responded to the challenges of the day, not as victims, but really as participants. I dare say with these people sometimes as influencers, all of their actions and reactions guided by their Catholic faith. Here are some of the events leading up to the end of the cattle boom: the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Bear Flag, Gold Rush, and the squatters. Oh my gosh, that was a big thing. Floods, droughts, statehood, and land commissions and surveys. Now, I've addressed some of these events in my last talk, but I did promise you earlier that I would tell you about what happened between Vaca and Peña, and this pertains to the formation of the township of Vacaville. Vaca and Peña came as partners, as I mentioned. They didn't split the land grant in half with a line drawn down the middle. They had an agreement and commitment to plan their land sales where if one partner sold land, the other partner would sell the same acreage. These matters were discussed between them. In 1850, Vaca sold 1 square league, about 9 square miles of land, to William McDaniel with a provision that 1 square mile, 640 acres, would be used to create a township called Vacaville. Vaca received about half of the subdivided lots in the town. McDaniel's partner was a Benicia attorney, Lansing B. Misner. In exchange for laying out the town and tending to the legal paperwork, Misner received half of the land in the deal with Vaca. Vaca couldn't speak, read, or write English, but Misner, who was bilingual, was the interpreter for the transaction. McDaniel was a federal land agent, and he shouldn't have even been there. It was against the law for him to be part of the sale. Now, Vaca very well may have been tricked, as he claimed. He said he thought he only sold one square mile, not a square league, But he was complicit, at least to the degree that he had gone behind Peña's back to make the sale. The two men became hopelessly estranged. Vaca moved to the other side of the land grant, as I mentioned, and he died in 1856, before they were actually awarded the US land grant. In response to Vaca's land sale, Peña ended up receiving 200 lots in the town of Vacaville. This is one of the big reasons why we don't know so much about Vaca. Now, you don't need as much land to farm, and I really do believe that they knew this was coming. New Mexico had these same issues. No one in the world, though, would have dreamed it would have happened this quickly or this soon. The gold rush changed everything up. With the loss of land, ranching eventually gave way to major agricultural production, first with wheat, and then when the horticulturists such as John Wolfskill, who was our neighbor right to the north, and his Southern California, William, figured out in the late 1850s that fruits matured early in the valley. Pears, apricots, cherries, and plum trees were planted and soon sold commercially. Vacaville would later become the fresh fruit capital of California, shipping fruit and nut products throughout the nation. While the loss of land was the death knell for many ranchos, and you often hear the stories about the Californians and it being a terrific loss for them. For this family, it wasn't. For a number of people in the family, they concentrated their efforts on these 3 farms, and these 3 rancheros, that's rancher Demetrio, Juan, my own great-grandfather, and Nestora, all made a successful transition to farming. In an interview, this is the part of the interview, with Rodney Rulofson, who is a curator of the Peña-Adobe in the 1960s, my great aunt Rose, who lived again 1881 to 1976. I might not have given you the dates. Recalls the vegetables grown by 1960. Interestingly, she's listed watermelons and the squash and the pumpkins all as vegetables here. They're actually fruits. And watermelon was Juan or John. That was his predominant crop. Here's some other slides I made of this slides. So I have a slide of 4 slides here. And Rose remembers the bounty in other areas. We have fruits, shrubs, old trees, and flowers grown in Nestora's gardens. The adobe and its surroundings were really a beautiful place in her day. In her 80s, Rose wrote the following passage from a collection of letters between her and Wood Young, the author of the Vaca Peña book. My great aunt Rose's letter is read by her granddaughter, my second cousin, Darlene. Darlene?
I'm right here.
Yeah.
Going to adjust the mic and stuff.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. May 20th, 1964. Dear Mr. Young, another thing I wanted to mention and always forget. One reads so much about the fun the early settlers had, such as rodeos, bullfights, dances, etc. But not much is mentioned about how hard they worked. They had to build their homes. They had to clear the land, plant and harvest all their food. They had no windmills, and all water was pumped by hand, both for domestic and animal use in gardening. No tractors, so they had to raise feed for the horses and cattle. As in the summer, all was dry. All food such as vegetables and grains had to be planted, and what could be dried was stored. They learned to can fruit also. The women cooked by wood stoves and made all their bread, cakes, and pies. In fact, all the food was cooked. They made their own bacon and ham, cheese, and sausage and lard. They did all the sewing, at first by hand and then by treadle machine. They made all the clothes for both men, women, and children, even all the underwear for the male and female. The men were able to get coats and pants, and the men folks got up at 5 o'clock, worked, and came in at noon and had dinner, not lunch. Rested, siesta, about half an hour, and back to work until 6. And then they tended to the horses and cattle and milked the cows and then had supper. They also had to cut and saw wood for cooking and for heating. And believe me, it took a lot of wood. After supper in summertime, all sat outdoors and sang and played the guitar, accordion, harmonicas, and also a Jew's harp. The children played games, then prayers, and to bed. Even in my day in 1885, etc., I saw this done. And through all this, they were so thankful and so happy, and still took time to help some less fortunate than them. You'll be glad when you finish this job, as I know I bother you so much with unimportant things. Sincerely, Mrs. Rose Peña-Coombs.
Thanks, Darlene.
You're welcome.
So we preserve the history of the land, the adobes, the family, and their lives. And we also preserve their artifacts. Some of the most important we have are 17 books from the Peña Library. Contrary to certain accounts, these people were not illiterate. All of the children had been tutored and were likely fully literate in Spanish. Nestora was the only one formally educated, though. She attended St. Catherine's Academy in Benicia around 1854 to 1859, really at the beginning of schools in California. This isn't long after California became a state. So they read California state books. She then taught her brothers and whoever else wanted to learn, including the children who worked on the rancho. Our 17 books on display in our museum include a diary. We have a couple of complete volumes. Here's one that has 6 in it. Another has 2. We have school books in English. These were Nestora's school books, and one that Gavino had, an arithmetic book. The literature is in Castilian Spanish, as are all of the prayer books. The books belong to and were shared by a number of family members. These family members, here's Rose, here's Juan and Francisca. These are my great-grandparents, Darlene and mine. This is my own grandfather. All these people's names were on these books, and that's why they appear here. But they were shared amongst them. This is, for me, besides the adobe, a really important artifact that we still have. To me, the books are the most important. I love the books. That we actually, I actually have modern books here. So most of these books are still available, still in print, mind you. And it's really exciting for me to read what my own family read. Nestora had owned the adobe and 900 acres of land since she was only 23 and fresh from school. Before she passed away in 1922, she gifted my grandfather Vidal, an attorney who had managed her ranch with some, she gave him some land, and she gave her close niece, the oldest granddaughter land and the redwood clad adobe. Now, this is really interesting. This is an interesting part. Here's the story. Now, this could have been, we figured out that this child couldn't be older than 10. This is Maria Dolores. Given their age difference then, Nestora would only have been about 23 here. But this could have been about the time she graduated and about the time that she bought the rancho. Here in 1917, on the occasion of her gifting the adobe to Maria Dolores, who is this woman here. Maria Dolores is here hiding behind the hollyhocks. And although it's not recorded anywhere, we all at the Peña-Vaca really think that this woman right here is Nestora. As we came to this conclusion, it's like, who else could it be? Who else would it be? Who would be part of this celebration? So that's kind of cool. So this is Nestora, possibly, likely. Now, the adobe remained with Maria Dolores's children until 1957. Oh, this is the front of the house, by the way. You've pretty much only seen the back here. This is the front. The fancier, it has fancier porch and posts there. Their desire, the family's desire for the adobe to become a Vacaville Park was fulfilled in 1965. We fulfill our mission at the adobe to preserve the history of the Peña-Vaca by sharing it. The Peña-Vaca Historical Society was established in 2004, staffed by volunteers. The park now includes the Mowers Goheen Museum, the Willis Lynn Jepson Memorial Garden, the Indian Council Ground, and picnic and recreation facilities. This year, we will be open probably May through October on the first Saturday of the month. Now, private tours are available, though, upon request. Come visit us, Dixon Historical Society, and of course, anyone else here who'd like to. This is the completion of my portion of the talk. Thank you very much. Armando?
Simon of talking about vaqueros. And the vaqueros were the indigenous people that were taught to be cowboys for taking care of the cows and the bulls. But these people, once it became vaqueros, were selectively picked by the ranch owner and the mission to be the vaquero, the worker. And in 1787, the governor, Spanish governor, Mexican governor of California, received a letter from a priest, a friar, asking permission to train these people to become vaqueros. Now, a lot of the indigenous people were warlike, you might say, still rebellious. And the governor protested and said, no, you can't train this indigenous people to be vaqueros. They might use his horses against us. Because you have to remember that in California, there were no horses until the Spaniards brought them for the ranches that they owned. But anyway, he gave in, and the friars did train. The friars and the ranch hands from Mexico came. They trained these people to be vaqueros, how to ride the horses. Evidently, they became very, very good cowboys. They were given the lasso made of leather from cows. They were given boots. They were given pantalones. They were given a vest and shirt. And they all got into their uniforms to go work in the fields. It happened for a couple of generations. But anyway, they would have a long, long work ahead of them with the cattle, moving them from one place to another. And keeping them, protecting them from grizzly bears, wolves, and rustlers. And that's the way they would make their living. They had two types, one that would live in the mission and take care of the herd there. And some that lived outside the mission, they were kind of like they're on their own. And from here, you could see up to the end of the cattle bearing industry that there was a transition of the indigenous people learning the ways of the Californians. And from there, they became their own little areas or societies. But they became very, very good horsemen. And you could see here in this paragraph that when some vaquero had performed his work with great skill, the other men would look at each other, smile, and approvingly would say, "Se crió con entre los indios, pues." Well, he was brought up among the Indians for being such a great vaquero. What's 6?
Want me to go next?
Okay. This is a slide that they wanted me to present, Cecilia. She wanted me to present this. As you can see, the top one on the left is an old ancient Indian, Mendoza. I don't know who that guy is. But he's talking about some items that we have on display. The next one to the right, you will see that these are the baskets that the indigenous people of California would make from the resources they had, the special type of tules, type of weed or branches. And they were very meticulous about the quality of that branch to make these beautiful baskets. They even make huge baskets for acorn storage. And they would just fill them up for the winter. They would cook from these baskets. And we say, well, that's all wood. They would probably burn. But what they did is they would get their basket by a fire and heat stones. Put the water in the baskets, and these are specially made, very watertight type of baskets. And they would put the hot stones in the water, and it would just sizzle and sizzle. When it cooled down, they take it out and then put another hot stone. Pretty soon they had boiling water in the basket. And that's how they would cook most of their, they would cook their acorns and make soup from a deer or quail or whatever they wanted to make out of it. But these were very, very helpful for the people, the lady of the house. On the far left, you see the molcajetes. These are the grinding seeds and spices for grinding up corn. They would use that. Now, my mom had one of those since she was a little girl. She used that to cook for us. And she would make the hot, oh my God, the hot chilies, the red chilies, toast it and dry it, and then use the molcajete to grind it up and make some hot sauce. Woo, that's some good stuff. In some cases, they found graveyards with a woman and they buried that molcajete in her grave. That's how important it is for the indigenous people. That was like an honor that she was such a great cook and user of the natural things that were given to us by that great creator. And there's an extension of that. And down here in the far side, the lower part, you see the arrowheads. Those, of course, they were made from mostly from stone and from obsidian. And you could see that there were different sizes. Some so tiny that those were used for like birds, little birds, because they had to find food, right? You wake up in the morning, you just don't go and run off and buy food. And mama would have to get up very, very early in the morning, start the fire, start cooking. And in some cases with a small little tiny arrows, the kids are learning to be warriors. They're learning to hunt. So they would make their own bow and arrows with the obsidian, and they would go shoot doves or rabbits if they could, and they would come back with dinner. That's our man right there, Chief Solano. This is who I talked about last time, Sam Yetoho, great chief. And he worked with side by side with General Vallejo and General Vallejo's army to bring down the rogue Indians and bring them in. And well, and there's no other word to explain, but they would slaughter villages, his own, but those villages were the ones that were his biggest enemies. They were enemies, so he would lead the charge into the tribes and eliminate them. Just another one. So we're okay. That almost brought me to tears. A picture with a lady. She reminded me a great deal of my grandmother. And how can I explain this? Her pride, you might say, reminds me of my mother. My mom was a very strong woman, but as you could see, they're using the holes, the rocks to grind their acorns and food that they had. So that was a very kind of emotional to me when I saw that. On the right side, you see the acorns. And again, you see more of the rocks where they grinded spices and fruit, acorns. And then there's another one down there somewhere. You would find them all over the place. Sorry, the rock. This far one, that smiley face, one of the Miwok guys that came down to be with us at the adobe said that was most likely a medicine rock where the medicine man would work. My great grandfather was a medicine man. He's a curandero. He worked with the people at the villages. So as you could see that they found that around the Utahawk Creek, and they brought it to the Peña-Vaca. Here's a great picture of an eagle with pines around. Animals were so important to us. They still are. We still believe in it, that everything has a soul. So the animals, we don't pray, honor them as a god or anything. We just praise and appreciate it. And in most indigenous people, we take down an animal, we'd always say a prayer over the soul to be released into the heavens. This up here, you can see it says Willis Jepson Memorial Garden, native plants, but actually that was originally planned by Bob Allen, a gentleman from Vacaville. He's the one that kind of started the indigenous plants from just from the California area that are growing right now. And we were very lucky that professional gardeners came by our adobe, and they were their guests on a Saturday, and they saw the area. They saw the area where the plants were. They came back, and for free, they refurbished plants in there. They took care of it. They put watering hoses to water the plants. I mean, it's growing very beautiful again, whereas before there were a lot of weeds. So we were just very thankful for these people that came and did that for us here. And this one over here, that is a graveyard of the indigenous people that live right on that land in that valley. It's right next to Peña-Vaca. And you can see it has a writing on it. And actually, and more or less, it says, we don't know who you are. We don't know when you lived. But we are grateful that we can acknowledge you and continue living in our land here in this valley, this lagoon. So they found 7 skeletons of the people there, and now there's a big rock formation around the area with that plaque right there of the indigenous people that lived there. That was, I believe, it was found when they started to restore the Peña-Vaca. And this part of it right there. So talking back about the vaqueros, they would have what they call the rodeo. They would bring in the cattle, count all the cattle they had. Then they would rope them with the lassos that they would make and brand them. They would get the hoofs, rope, and the other guy would come and brand them and actually fix that ear brand too. But then afterwards, there was a great party, fiesta. Just like Cecilia mentioned, where the people come into the adobe, the peñas, and have a big fiesta with 2 instruments playing. And they would just have a good time. Also, they have what they call the matanza. This is when they would slaughter the cows. Very cruel. But what they would do is they bring 1 cow at a time, and again, the hoofs were roped. A guy would jump in with a machete and cut the throat, and then send it off, and somebody else would come and finish the jobs. The people would all work together and finish the job using all the products, big products that the cow had, like for tallow, the hides, a lot of cowboy boots and purses and things like that were made from the leather. But then again, after all the hard work that they did, you would have a grand fiesta again. There's party animals. So anyway, there's not much talk, not much about the vaqueros, but I could just clearly see reading these articles that that was the start of the big transition of the indigenous people to be converted into Californians. That's a big change. They were the vaqueros that lived outside the mission. They were all independent. They lived with their families. They took care of the cows, and then they would have the rodeo, the bringing in of the cows and meet up with people, just like we do now with what we call a powwow. And they would all meet together again and show off their hard work, bringing in all the good cattle that they took care of for the year. The matanzas usually started in July through August, and the branding in June. Usually they would herd all the cattle, drive in and brand them, mark them on the year, you count them. So that was a big thing for these vaqueros. But then slowly, as the settlers came in, they took over the job, and of course the missions were not existing, almost non-existent there. And so anyway, that's the way that was with the vaqueros. And just to let you know, my dad, born in Chihuahua, around Chihuahua, Mexico, he's a Tarahumara. Besides, I'm a Apache and Tarahumara. Well, he was a vaquero. but it wasn't cows, it was sheep. And he lived in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And he would work for the gentleman there that owned all the sheep. And he would go out in the desert with a little wagon for food and keep an eye on all the sheep out there. He had his gun and his horse and his little chuck wagon, and spent weeks out there working, taking care of the cattle that were there. So that was kind of exciting for me to learn. Besides my great grandfather being a curandero, it was really, really amazing, amazing. So I'm pretty much done. They only gave me a small assignment. It was fun looking at it. Not like last time where I messed up with all my papers. I was stacked. I want everybody to put their hand up, right hand up. Put your hand up. Yatahe. Yatahe. Thank you.
Okay, so during our three-part series, we've introduced you to a lot of settlers and a lot of indigenous people in our local area and the Lagoon Valley. We've talked about the Peñas, the Vacas, the Armijos, the Berriesas, General Vallejo, Chief Solano. Today, we heard from Luzina Stanley Wilson and Rose Peña Coombs. And now we'd like to introduce you to another settler that was here back then, and his name is Edwin Markham. Edwin Markham grew up in the Lagoon Valley, and he referred to himself as the young vaquero on his mother's cattle range. He arrived here when he was 4 years old. His parents divorced. They lived in Oregon, and they divorced, and he followed his mother down here when he was 4. And he actually had a taste for education. He really didn't want to farm, but he was the only son, so he had to do it. And he describes living in this little valley. He says, my mother made her home on a farm and cattle range in the Little Lagoon Valley. It was among the picturesque mountains not far from the Great Sea. Here in this little valley and the breezy summits that surround it, I spent all the days and nights of my restless boyhood, because he didn't want to really farm. But he does talk about riding with Senor Peña, and he describes him as the cattleman whose Spanish land grant reached far into the surrounding hills. So you often found Markham riding with all the other vaqueros, helping all the other landowners like Peña, doing what Marmda was talking about. You had to round up these cattle once a year. And so this was something that he did for most of his youth before he got out of the Lagoon Valley and got to go to school. He eventually became a teacher, became a teacher, and then eventually became a superintendent of schools. His love for poetry really flourished when he established the Poetry Society of America in 1910. He became poet laureate of his home state of Oregon. And he wrote, he's got a huge body of work of poems. In 1922, his poem, Lincoln, a Man of the People, it was selected out of 250 other poems to be read at the dedication for the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. So when you go to Washington, D.C. and see the Lincoln Memorial, you'll see the plaque about Edwin Markham from Vacaville. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to have Brian Irwin, another docent from Peña-Adobe, who would like to read a poem for you about the Lagoon Valley from Lagoon Valley's very own poet, Edwin Markham.
The valley. I know a valley in the summer hills, haunted by little winds and daffodils. Faint footfalls and soft shadows pass at noon. Noiseless at night, the clouds assemble there, and ghostly summits hang below the moon. Dim visions lightly swung in silent air.
Okay. So We have a few minutes. What questions do you have for us? Okay. All right, then, I want to thank you for your time. We appreciate coming out, and we thoroughly enjoyed this three-part series. If you'd like to meet me and James in the back, we can show you some of the articles that we brought from our museum, and thank you again.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's just been a pleasure and an honor to work with all of your team in the Peña-Vaca Historical Society and the Vacaville Heritage Council. It's just been amazing, and I hope you'll come back and attend some more of our presentations. I know we'll still get to keep Ryan and Jess. They will come and continuously help us with the technology and recording. So we're grateful, but I encourage all of you to visit, if you haven't already, the Peña-Vaca Historical Society. Their location, the Adobe is just filled with information, and they have various programs. They have summer camps for children. And so you are all great mentors for us here in Dixon as we continue with our own projects here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Cecilia also. And we'll be in touch. We have refreshments. So you're welcome to refreshments, coffee and water and juice. And then any questions you have, you can.
There we go.